The International Energy Agency says the Asia-Pacific region contributed about half of global carbon dioxide emissions from energy use in 2019. New research by experts at the Australian National University reveals how Australia alone could reduce carbon emissions in APAC by more than 8%. To tell us how, I'm joined now by Paul Burke, Professor and Head of the Art Corden Department of Economics at the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU. Paul, 8.6% is the exact number, and it's a big one, and it can be achieved by replacing some commodity exports with green alternatives. Tell us more.
Yes, that's right. Australia is currently a very large exporter of fossil fuels. We're the largest exporter of coal, the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. If we were to replace those fossil fuel exports with clean energy exports, and also if we were to use some of our minerals that we export, use them locally, but do our processing using renewable energy, we could help reduce Asia-Pacific emissions quite substantially. Our calculations indicate that about 8.6% of the region's emissions could be abated or reduced under that scenario. Even if we could only do part of that, that would be a big contribution.
So I'm going to be a little bit cynical here, Paul, but I wanted to ask you how likely it is. I mean, you're talking about replacing the exports of commodities like you mentioned some of them there, but like thermal coal, another one is LNG, another one is iron ore. And what is the likelihood of Australia not exporting iron ore?
Well, short run likelihood of this change is very low. But over time, there are huge opportunities here. And that's really the key point. Coal and natural gas exports as well, these will not be around in the long run. In particular, coal, it's a highly polluting fuel, in particular, thermal coal. So the prospects are not good for those coal and also LNG exports when we're looking at 10, 20, 30 years down the track. When it comes to production of metals, there are opportunities in Australia, green aluminium and green steel. The steel industry is a huge one, and it would be difficult for Australia to really carve out a large share of it. But even if we could start to get moving with some projects to demonstrate what's possible. And here, one other thing to keep in mind is it's not only Australian capital that would be doing this. Really, we could be having large inflows of capital to be investing in green steel production in Australia. The key point is we have this strong comparative advantage. We have the iron ore. We're a good country for capital investments. And also we have this great endowment of renewable energy, solar, wind, and great land endowments as well.
What sort of response are you getting from the public, whether it's the private sector or the public sector? What sort of response are you getting when you put your research in front of them?
Well, there's a lot of interest in this topic in Australia at the moment. So in the private sector, there are various proposals to be exporting things such as green ammonia, green electricity, and also to be producing green steel in Australia as well. The newly elected government in Australia is also very interested in this topic, and it's one of their priorities to develop Australia as a renewable energy superpower, which really is this idea of let's embrace these great technologies and our great endowments in solar, wind and land, and also potentials for things such as pumped hydro energy storage. So really, this is a topic whose time has come. It's not a goal that can be achieved overnight. And it's a process, it's a road to be driven down. We're going down that road. There's the private sector that's interested, the government's interested. Not all projects will go ahead, but the long run opportunity is very much there.
So you talked about renewables, specifically wind and solar, and then you talked about land. And of course, in Australia, we have an abundance of land that's currently not being used. How much of this land would need to be used for renewable to achieve that 8.6%?
Well, in our paper, we present some calculations that suggest that in an extreme scenario, about 2% of Australia's land could be used for solar and wind farms, and that would be for producing the green electricity for export, green hydrogen for export, and also the renewable energy needs to be producing green aluminium and green steel to meet that 8.6% reduction in regional emissions that you mentioned. 2% of Australia's landmass is a big area. And environmental protections will be an important part of the story. We need to get that right. But also think of the benefits. We wouldn't need to be opening new coal mines. We could forget about opening new gas fields as well if we were to go down this path. So really it's a choice that we have in front of us. Do we want to be using more of our land for solar and wind? And we need to get it right in terms of where these projects are located. We want them to be in the best possible places that have the lowest ecological impacts as well.
Where do you see the capital coming from, Paul? You know, this is obviously a big idea. It is financially expensive. A lot of capital would be needed in order for this transition to take place. Is this a public-private partnership type model that you'd like to see in order to make this happen?
Mostly from the private sector. There's a role for government investment in things like research and development and in infrastructure, for example, transmission lines domestically in Australia. But for these big projects themselves, what's really needed is large-scale private investment, and that capital would be from both domestic and also foreign sources. Australia is a capital importing country, and really we need that to continue. We have these great opportunities here. This is a capital-intensive road to be going down. So really we would need to be having quite large-scale capital inflows from the United States, from around the world, and in particular from the Asia-Pacific, given that those countries with large markets, lots of capital available in countries such as China, and our exports will be going to those markets. So very important to be having investment coming from those markets too.
You know, this piece of work that you've done on this is the first of its kind. You know, it's the first really to quantify this, you know, when we're looking at the energy, the land, the water requirements of transferring to this, I suppose, net zero export model. Was there anything that came out along the journey that surprised you? Were there any results that surprised you?
One interesting result is related to water use. Producing hydrogen, green hydrogen, does require water. So you produce electricity, you get water, and then you split the water to produce the hydrogen. Where does the water come from? Because, of course, Australia is a dry country. Our answer to that was, let's desalinate water. And the interesting thing was that the energy required to do that desalination, it's actually relatively small compared to the energy required to produce the hydrogen itself. So that was one of the interesting aspects.
So what do you see as the biggest stumbling block? I mean, obviously Australia has the opportunity here to lead the way. You know, can we step into that leadership position?
For products such as green hydrogen, exports from Australia face many challenges. There are lots of potential competitors. Direct electricity being produced in countries such as Japan from sources such as offshore wind, or green hydrogen produced in the Middle East, for example. So that's a very competitive market. It makes sense for Australia to focus on some of the best opportunities. Green ammonia seems like one of them. Ammonia is used for fertilizers and other things. And really, if we could get into that market and produce ammonia in a low emissions way based on hydrogen production using solar and wind energy, that would really make a first great step in reducing emissions.
Well, Professor, we're going to be following your work very, very closely. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Paul Burke with us there, Professor and Head of the Arne Corden Department of Economics at the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU.